Kia ora, I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist Professor Robert Patman, and this is Global Insight. Russia and Ukraine continue to slug it out. The death toll after 5 months of war is estimated at more than 15,000 Russians and Ukrainians, including thousands of civilians. Ukraine has been bolstered by weapons from NATO countries. Russia has started using its gas supply to Europe as a weapon. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce.
Russia has cut its gas supply to Europe, but in terms of global conflicts, is this anything unusual for a country to use its natural resources to push back against the allies of its enemy?
Well, certainly we've had wars and conflicts in the past fought over access to resources. You could say that the beginnings, or at least part of the Second World War, when Nazi Germany invaded Russia, was all about access to oil in the Caucasus for Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich. So, in a sense, resources have often figured prominently in conflict. But what's really different about this is that while countries often try to use their resources to good advantage in a relatively peaceful context, we gave an extreme example of Hitler's invasion, but in normal global politics, countries try to, and we try to make best advantage of the resources we have for commercial reasons. But what is exceptional about this, and this is where what Putin is doing is completely a departure from, or a break from the normal procedures in international politics, is the fact that having invaded a country which is completely illegal, it was an unprovoked invasion, Putin leadership is proceeding to apply pressures on those countries supporting Ukraine through gas, but he's also applying pressures against countries which are not involved or even supporting Ukraine, such as countries in Asia and Africa, which depend on food exports, or food imports, I should say, from their point of view, from both Ukraine and Russia. Russia's made it quite clear it will only export food to what it calls its friends. Anyone hostile to Russia, and which means supporting Ukraine, Mr. Putin served warning that they may not receive food from them. The big problem is that Mr. Putin has basically prevented, by having a naval blockade around the Black Sea, prevented Ukraine from exporting millions of tons of grains exports. And this means that the price is sharply rising and food is in short supply in many developing countries. So we're heading towards something of a food crisis, and it's a deliberate weapon by the Putin government to try to create pressure for sanctions to be lifted against Russia and for Russia to consolidate its gains in the Ukraine.
Putin has given some agreement to allow some grain exports. Are you expecting that to change the equation?
In politics, there's sometimes a gap between appearance and reality. And I think Mr. Putin felt under pressure. He doesn't like, just because people take these measures, they don't like actually being seen to be doing it. So, the Putin authoritarian government allowed Turkey to broker a deal between Ukraine and Russia, which would, in theory, allow movement of its exports out of Black Sea ports. But one of the crucial ports was bombed within a day of the agreement being signed, which really, I think, cast doubt about how serious Russia is about allowing Ukraine to export its goods. And not only does it not only has Russia blocked Ukraine from a major export of Ukraine, namely food, but it's also, there's pretty strong evidence, including from the UN, that Russia, in the parts of Ukraine it's invaded and occupied, has stolen Ukraine produce and attempted to sell it. So, yeah, this is sort of basically outlaw behaviour on the international stage.
Do you think this reduced gas supply, as Europe heads towards autumn, Do you think it's going to soften Europe's stance towards Russia or harden it?
I think it could do both, because I think Europe's likely to be divided on this question. Already we've seen a Putin supporter, Mr. Viktor Orban, in Hungary, call for sanctions to be lifted and said that, we should do everything possible to restore normal gas supplies. So there are divisions there. I get the feeling, however, Germany is already preparing its population for higher gas prices. These are happening. And it'll be interesting to see what happens. But certainly that is Mr. Putin's intention. He wants a backlash by European consumers against high prices, which he's instigated because of their government support of these countries in Western Europe for the Ukraine. But there's another side to this story, which is that many Europeans are fully aware that Mr. Putin is attempting to create a greater Russia at the expense of Ukraine, an imperial conquest. And we live in an interconnected world, or at least we do if you live in a liberal democracy. And I think there may be, Mr. Putin may have overplayed his hand. The signs are, according to polls in Germany, that the majority of people prepare to pay more for gas in order that their country keeps supporting Ukraine in the conflict. And let's be quite clear about this, Bruce. Mr. Putin's in a race against time. As you know, I've never bought into the argument that Mr. Putin can fight a long war here. Yeah? We're talking about quite a small economy by international standards, and sanctions are progressively hurting. So this is why he's aggressively using the instruments of food and gas to weaken and squeeze support for Ukraine. And we don't know how that will work out.
Okay, and on that note, there's been talk about a land for peace deal. Could US President Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, could they force Ukraine to accept such a deal?
Well, there's certainly a division of opinion within the Western world. There's a group of diplomats and scholars who call themselves realists. Dr. Henry Kissinger, the former US Secretary of State, represents them to some degree, but he's not alone. And he says that, Ukraine will never defeat Russia. Therefore, it should give up, be prepared to cede territory, and that Mr. Putin must never be humiliated. And therefore, the question is, will Ukraine accept that? And all the indications are they won't. And the other aspect to your question is, even if Mr. Biden wanted to, and there's no indication he will want to do a deal at Ukraine's expense, I don't think they could deliver. Ukraine's not a small country. It's 42 million people plus. And the other thing to note here is that great powers are in no position to call the tune here. The United States was defeating Afghanistan, Iraq, and Vietnam. The Soviet Union was defeated in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So why should Dr. Kissinger insist Ukraine can never win against Russia? Russia's army has performed pretty incompetently so far, despite the balance of power being in its favour. So I think from a New Zealand point of view, we would probably on balance prefer that support for Ukraine continue to the point where the costs of the war became prohibitive for the Putin regime and it was forced to withdraw troops from Ukraine. Because that would help protect the international rules-based order of which this country depends, and most middle and small powers.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Noho ora mai.